Good morning and welcome to Sunday School. My name is Mike Stedham and I'm your virtual Sunday School teacher this week here at Anniston First United Methodist Church. I'm the regular Sunday School teacher for the Genesis class. Once a month I get to teach the Carré class here at church as well. And we welcome you to our Sunday School. I'd like to thank the church staff, especially Pastor Kyle. He's the Steven Spielberg of our church staff. He's the videographer, the choreographer. He is the director, and he puts all this stuff together, and I really appreciate him doing that for us. And I am so glad that we have an opportunity to continue a Bible study, even in these times when, for our safety and the safety of the people that we love, the people around us, we need to be at home. We need to be away from large gatherings, that kind of thing. It's nice to have this avenue, and again, I'm very thankful to our church for making this available. So today we're going to have a lesson from the Old Testament. We're in the book of 2 Kings. In fact, we're at the end of the book of 2 Kings, and we're going to be looking at the final days of the nation of Judah. Just a little bit of background here. These lessons that we are studying, these were put together months and months ago. Certainly the people who were putting these together had no concept of the kind of situation the world would be in when the lesson was actually taught. Ironically, during this Lenten season, the thing we're studying is people who are in desperate times. Last week we talked about the temptations of Jesus. We've had Jesus at Gethsemane. We're going to have lessons. Next week will be the actual crucifixion. And we've had these lessons that show people when they're in times of great stress. And certainly we know right now we are under a lot of stress. And a lot of people are asking themselves what's next, what's going to go on. And so these lessons seem to have a special resonance, at least they do for me, as we look at what other people have done in these kinds of situations. I mentioned that this has kind of been a rough time. I don't know if you have any friends on Facebook, but the best comment I got was a friend of mine the other day said, "Boy, what a year we've had this last month." And nobody could have imagined that the world would have changed as much as it did in just a few short weeks. Well, we're going to talk about a group of people whose world was also changing. They had a little more time to get ready for it. Unfortunately, the situation did not end up good for them at that particular time. As I said, we're in the book of 2 Kings, and we're going to talk about the final kings of the nation of Judah. Now, remember that in the Old Testament, after the reign of Saul, then we had David, and we had Solomon, then the nation of Israel split into two different countries. We have the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, and we have the nation of Judah, which is the southern kingdom. By the end of the book of Kings, the book of 2 Kings here, the nation of Israel has long since fallen to the Assyrians, and now we have just the nation of Judah, and they have been under fire for quite some time from the nation of Babylonia. Now, Babylonia has been fighting with the Assyrians and with the Egyptians, and largely the nation of Israel gets caught up in a lot of this. And their final few kings really are part of this geopolitical struggle that's going on. But today we're going to look at how this impacted the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, and what was going on with them. They lived in uncertain times, and one thing I can say about our times, the only thing we know for certain is we know nothing for certain. We don't really know what's going to happen next, and that's sometimes the most frightening thing of all, is the unknown, not being sure where we're going with all this, these things that are happening. So today we're going to look at some people who also were facing, in their minds, a very uncertain future, and see what the last days of the nation of Judah were like. We're in the book of 2 Kings, and we're going to start at the beginning of the 25th chapter, because this is the very last chapter in the book, and again, the last part of the history of the nation of Judah. And the last king of Judah, his name's actually fairly easy to remember, Zedekiah, because our friends in the United Kingdom, Zed is their name for the letter Z, the last number of the alphabet. So Zedekiah, that's a pretty easy way of remembering, he's the last king. In the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. he encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. Now, this is one of the most cruel forms of warfare there is, to put your army around a city and starve the people out. Sometimes it's just appalling to think about the kind of inhumanity we've been able to inflict on each other during the centuries. And the idea of using starvation as a method of warfare is abhorrent to us today. But they had no Geneva Convention. They had no Geneva back in the Old Testament. And so this was one of the ways that if you couldn't get through a wall to get into a walled city, well, you would just starve the people out. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's gardens, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him on the plains of Jericho. So they waited until the people were at their very weakest. They were able to breach the wall. They got in there. The army of Judah tries to escape. They're trying to get out while the getting's good, as it were. But, of course, the Babylonians outnumbered them. They had them surrounded, and they took them captive. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. This is King Zedekiah. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where the sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with the bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. So once again, the incredible cruelty, just the inhumanity of this is Shakespearean level, what they did to this king. Again, the inhumanity of what's going on. So clearly, the writer of the book of Kings is showing us how bad the Babylonians were. Now, I should mention that at the beginning of all this, a couple of chapters earlier, the people of Israel, the people of Judah, were trying to figure out why this had happened to them. Well, the writers of the Hebrew Bible are very clear. They see what is happening here as the punishment that the people of Judah receive for their infidelity, for their betraying God's trust. God allows these things to happen to them. Now, this also assumes, and in the theology of their day, that God wasn't just the God of Israel. They call him the God of Israel because he has a special relationship with the children of Israel. But they also believe that he's the God that created everything, that he's in charge of everything. Unlike many of the deities, the local deities that various people worshipped in those days, he was not seen as a God who was limited to one place or one time. So they believed that the ill things that were falling upon them at this time were as a result of their sinning, of what they had done against God. So they're seeing this as their punishment. This is the same message we get from Jeremiah, the other prophets who were writing about this about the same time. So King Zedekiah is taken away. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. So now they've breached the wall, the army has left, the Babylonians have captured the city. Instead of conquering this, taking it over, making it part of their empire, they decide they're just going to destroy the whole thing. And they burn down, and we've given these buildings an order of importance for the people of Jerusalem, the temple, the most important structure in the city of Jerusalem, the building that was built by Solomon. In the first part of the book of 1 Kings, around the 7th chapter, we get a description of this amazing temple, this amazing structure that was constructed, because this is where the people are going to come and have communion with God. This is where God reaches down and touches God's people. And so the building that they build for this purpose is magnificent. It is a structure that is hard to imagine. We have artist depictions of it, but Solomon's temple was one of the great buildings that we have described for us in the Hebrew Bible. And the furnishings are beautiful. The place is magnificent. They have gold, they have silver, and more importantly to the Babylonians, they have a very precious metal called bronze, which of course they're able to use in warfare as well as for the great wealth that it brings them. So the army goes in, they burn down the temple, then they burn down the palace. This was built during David's reign. And then all of the important houses, they basically lay waste to the town of Jerusalem. They destroy it so it's not going to be livable for any time soon. The whole Babylonian army, under the command of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. This, we believe, is about the third wave of people who had been taken from Judah and taken to Babylon. And you just have to put yourself in the place of these people, the people who had lived in Judah. They had, of course, read the story, learned the story of the Hebrew people, how they really began as a nation in bondage. They were a people that did not have a land of their own. Moses came and brought them out of captivity. God led Moses to bring them out of the land of Egypt, gave them this land that was going to be their inheritance. So long as they honored God, so long as they kept God's command, they were going to be okay. Then we have the judges, we have the prophets, all of them warning the people, don't betray your relationship with God. Don't do that, or a punishment is going to come. Well, that's eventually what happened. And so the people who were living in those days, it would have been hard for them to see past the captivity, because now they are being led hundreds of miles away from their home. These people, for the most part, are never going to see their homes again. Their children or children's children, we know later, are going to have a chance to come back, at least in some form. But for these people, it's all over. This is the end of the line. One historian I was reading this week said that this passage here, where we're reading today at the end of 2 Kings, basically marks the end of the history of Israel as a nation and the beginning of the Hebrew people. Because even though they are taken into captivity, they do not give up their identity when they're in Babylon. And if you really want a good story that explains what it's like to hold on to your culture, even though you're trying to be assimilated into another culture, read the book of Daniel, because that's pretty much the theme there, and it covers all that very well. So basically, most of the people in Judah have been taken away, and this is the third wave taken away. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. So it's an interesting idea. The Babylonians weren't going to live there themselves. They were going back to Babylonia. They were taking most of the people with them, but they were going to leave behind just a few caretakers. And this is an interesting passage because we know by reading the later books in the Bible that indeed the remnant does come back. And there are some people who had been there during the 70 or so years between the beginning of the Babylonian captivity and the return of some of the exiles. The Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars, the movable stands, and the bronze sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and they carried the bronze to Babylon. Now, if you read the 7th chapter of 1 Kings, you get this description, not only of this great temple that was built, but also the furnishings that are in there. The sea that's described is this huge bronze bowl that was big enough to hold gallons and gallons of water. It's where the priests did their sacrificial cleansing before they went into the temple. So we today are very concerned about washing our hands. Well, the priests were also very concerned. They were a good example for us on how we should cleanse ourselves. And they had this huge bronze bowl that was called a sea because it contained so much water. This is where they had the water for their cleansing. They also took away the pots, shovels, wick trimmers, dishes, and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. Now, once again, the metal bronze was very, very useful to the people in biblical times, because for the people of Judah, for the people of Jerusalem, it was used as articles we have here in our church, items of worship, things where we serve God. The Babylonians could take the same material and forge it into weapons of war. This is what gave them the military dominance that they had, even though it wasn't quite enough to keep out the Assyrians a little bit later. The commander of the imperial guard took away the censers and sprinkling bowls, all that were made of pure gold or silver. So we can expect that the precious metals, that's also something they're going to take away as soon as they can. The bronze from the two pillars, the sea and the movable stands, which Solomon had made for the temple of the Lord, was more than could be weighed. So this is just an enormous amount, probably tons of material that were being taken away. Quite the prize for the Babylonian army to take with them. Each pillar was 27 feet high. The bronze capital on top of one pillar was 4.5 feet high and was decorated with a network and pomegranates of bronze all around. The other pillar, with its network, were similar. So basically, there are these beautiful structures, almost 3 stories high, that were taken away so that the metal could be repurposed in this case. The commander of the guard took prisoner Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. Of those still in the city, he took the officer in charge of the fighting men and 5 royal advisors. He also took the secretary, who was chief officer, in charge of conscripting the people of the land, and 60 of his men who were found in the city. So we're going from the top down. They've already got the king, now they're getting the priests, now they're getting the various other officials, anybody who had any position of authority or importance. They're going down the list that way. Nebuzaradan, the commander, took them all and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. There at Riblah, the land of Hamath, the king had them executed. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. So all of this detail has been really leading up to this one verse. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. For a people who for generations had identified themselves with the land in which they lived, the nation of Israel, now they were going to be someplace else, as they had begun in the nation of Egypt. As a people without a land, so they are going to end up now as a people without a land. And during the Babylonian exile, this is a very interesting time in the history of the Hebrew people. We wonder sometimes, why do we care what happened to this one little country 2,500 years ago? Why do we care about this? Well, because these were the people of God, and these were the people who were trying to understand the relationship that God has with human beings. And we see so much of ourselves in their behavior. Even today we see human nature in what they were doing here. And when they get to Babylon, they start sort of assessing. They're no longer able to count on the temple being the place where they go to meet God, because the temple has been destroyed. They're hundreds of miles away from it. Even if the temple had been there, they wouldn't have been able to make it back to the temple. So they are worshiping God and learning ways to hold on to what they have, their culture. They have the laws that Moses wrote down, that God gave to Moses. They have their culture, they have their history, they have their belief that Yahweh, their God, is the God of the universe, the God who's in charge of all this. And they hold out hope that at some point they're going to return. Now the prophets deal with that. Jeremiah specifically talks about the remnant returning. And the very end of the book of 2 Kings, this is not part of today's actual text, but I just wanted to mention it because it's kind of a nice little coda at the end of these passages. The book does not end on a note of defeat, but kind of on a different kind of note. The king before the last. The next to last king was named Jehoiachin. And he didn't last very long. I think he was on the throne about 6 months, something like that. He didn't last very long. He's taken away into captivity. And he actually becomes pretty well respected and has a position not of dishonor in the court in Babylon. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, the king of Babylon released Jehoiachin from the prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So the Babylonians had brought in the other people whom they had conquered. They brought their kings in, and Jehoiachin, the penultimate king of Judah, actually gets a place of honor here. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes, for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. So there's that little ray of possibility of light, something that might still be available to the people. So the book doesn't end on a completely down note. As I said, the rest of the series of lessons we're going to have the next few weeks, they're dealing with people in times of stress. We see ourselves, and I see a lot of myself in the behavior of the people of Israel, the temptations that they faced, the despair that they certainly felt. We can just have a little taste of that sometimes ourselves. Fortunately, the things that we face, we don't believe will ever get as bad as what they faced, being taken away into captivity, but it did force them into a realization that there are more important things than the land they lived on, than the material possessions. The things they were so proud of in the temple, they were things that could be taken away. There were things that could be repurposed for a different reason. And they had to face that reality, just as we have to face our reality today. Well, thank you for listening this week, and I hope that you've gotten a little something out of this message. Let's close with a word of prayer today. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the stories of the Hebrew Bible, of the people of Israel who loved you, who worshiped you, who tried to understand how to have a relationship with you. Help us today as we as Christians try to follow you, try to understand our relationship with you. We ask you to be with us during these particularly trying times, to remember, dear God, that you still love us, that you have our best interest at heart. Please go with us. Help us to reach out to others however we're able to during this time to show your love to them. In Christ's name, amen.